Thank you very much. So 150 years ago, Boston hosted the biggest musical event in our nation's history. It's called the National Peace Jubilee. It was, I think, the 19th century's version of Woodstock. And it was literally designed to promote peace and reconciliation following the close of the Civil War. It was an extravaganza. It had 1,000 orchestral participants, 10,000 choral singers, and the event attracted nearly 50,000 people. Took place just a few stones throw from where we are this evening. So, how many in the audience have heard of Woodstock? Raise your hand. Okay. How many people in the audience had heard of the National Peace Jubilee? Well, that's pretty good. More than I might have expected. I confess that I did not know about it, but I'm delighted that we're all here this evening and we're going to learn a lot about it. A number of the musicians who participated back in 1869 signed the wooden fan that you see on the screens around here, okay? I suppose, to continue the analogy, it was sort of the equivalent of Jimi Hendrix signing a program for the Woodstock Festival, right? Anyhow, that fan is part of the special collections of the Boston Public Library. Did you know that the BPL has a veritable treasure trove of artistic and cultural items? Yes, it has rare books, including the first folio from Shakespeare. I'm a lawyer, so I'm particularly intrigued by the idea that the collection includes John Adams's personal library. But way more than that, the library has over 1 million photographs, and it has a lot of art. From the Escher prints that were featured last year at the MFA to works by Toulouse-Lautrec that are going to be featured in the upcoming show at the MFA. Now back to the fan. A number of years ago, the BPL needed funding to conserve that fan. And they came to us, the associates of the Boston Public Library, and we were delighted to approve a grant to the library to facilitate the conservation of this unusual object. So my name is Peter Brown, and I'm honored to serve as the chairman of the Associates of the Boston Public Library. And we're an independent 501c3 whose primary mission is to provide grants to the library to support its cultural mission and to help preserve and conserve its many treasures. So I'm joined at the podium by the president of the library, who's David Leonard. Come up, come up, come up. We're in his house this evening, so we have to behave. And one of the things I suppose I should mention is please put your cell phones on mute, because we're about to have a concert. So among David's many accomplishments is he's presiding over a $15.7 million renovation of the library's Special Collections Department. So he's doing great work, and he's going to say a few words.
Thank you, Peter. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the library. Welcome to your library. Thank you very much for joining us tonight on what is an experimental and innovative program that we hope will continue to celebrate moments from Boston's musical past and from items from the Boston's own music collection. We know that tonight's particular event that we're marking on this occasion will elucidate themes of war, civil war, but more importantly, peace, healing, and opportunities to discuss conflict and leadership. We will be on an auditory journey tonight, and we will hear music and we will hear words. And we hope that you will all go away inspired, and that tonight's program will truly leave a mark that is innovative, just as the idea of the library itself was an innovative idea in 1848, the date of our charter. And so I'm now pleased to introduce to you the president of one of our major partners for tonight's performance, the new president of New England Conservatory, Andrea Kalin.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great privilege for all of us at NEC to be here tonight and joining all of you. We're very grateful to David and to Peter for partnering with us and allowing us to be part of this. You know, libraries are really the first point of advocacy. It's an entirely democratic concept. And that notion of bringing peace into the world and being able to celebrate that in this beautiful space with this gorgeous collection is for us just a true privilege. So we're delighted to be here. We thank you for letting us to be part of it. And we're very, very grateful to BPL and to the associates of BPL for their leadership in making this evening happen. Thank you.
Welcome to Boston. We're thrilled to have you. So I'm just going to point out that we're going to hear from Charles Peltz and the New England Conservatory Wind Ensemble, and Erica Washburn, who's the conductor of the NEC Chamber Singers. And would you all please rise for the singing of the national anthem? Okay, so have we intrigued you and whetted your appetite about the Peace Jubilee? I hope so, and I'm thrilled now to introduce Jake Sconyers, who's a local historian, and together with Nikki Stewart, runs a weekly podcast called Hub History. And Jake is going to tell us a little bit more about the history of the National Peace Jubilee. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. So Nikki and I are lucky enough to get to share our favorite stories from Boston history every week on our podcast. And I'm lucky enough to have been asked to share one of those stories with you tonight. So 150 years ago, the greatest musical extravaganza the world had ever seen was held right here in Copley Square. It was envisioned as a spectacular celebration of peace after the Union victory in the Civil War. And it featured choral performances, orchestras, and giant brass bands. I think that just barely hints at the scale of the performance. Each day's show opened with a hymn, and then before the intermission, they played the Star-Spangled Banner, which we just heard. There were pieces by Wagner and Mozart. The second act featured a newly written hymn of peace, the William Tell Overture, and then the Anvil Chorus, which we're lucky enough that we're going to hear that right after this. The Anvil Chorus was truly a spectacle to behold. It was sung by 10,000 vocalists who were backed by 1,000 instrumentalists. There was a battery of cannons, a convocation of church bells, a custom-made bass drum 8 feet in diameter, the world's largest pipe organ. And then at the climax, in marched 100 Boston firefighters carrying sledgehammers, who then pounded anvils in unison. If you can see the screens, we have a photo up showing some of those Boston firefighters posing in the public garden. And like all but one image we'll show tonight, and many of the images we use in our podcast research, that is from the BPL Special Collections. One account says that one of the spectators was just so overwhelmed by the experience that he ran out to the lobby and he sent a cable to his wife saying, "Come immediately. We'll sacrifice anything to have you here. Nothing like it in a lifetime." As a podcaster, it's hard for me to imagine what it would have been like inside the Grand Coliseum where the Jubilee was held. When we record the podcast, we want to put ourselves into the smallest possible space to control the echo. We surround ourselves with soft surfaces to reduce reverb. But the Grand Peace Jubilee was held in what was one of the largest buildings on the continent at the time. It was 350 feet wide and 550 feet long. That's over a football field wide and almost 2 long. Its walls enclosed 4.5 acres of land. The ceilings inside soared to 120 feet in height. This huge concert hall could seat up to 50,000 people. And just for comparison's sake, the modern TD Garden concert capacity is about 20,000. That means that at that time, this giant Jubilee Hall could hold twice the modern TD Garden. And this vast enclosure was built out of wood and metal with very little consideration for acoustics. When I look back on it, I think during a performance, the audience may not have been able to make out a single note. But it didn't matter. The sheer spectacle was overwhelming. It's probably an assault on the senses. Even if they couldn't exactly make out the music, the Jubilee kept audiences in the tens of thousands entertained throughout the 4-day run. President Grant took his cabinet to the performance on the second night. And when reporters asked him as he came out what he thought of the show, he replied in a tone that suggested perhaps the president's ears were more attuned to the clamor of the battlefield than the niceties of the concert hall. He said, "Well, I like the cannons." The Grand Peace Jubilee and that giant Coliseum, the Jubilee Hall that housed it, were the brainchild of Patrick Gilmore. Gilmore was native of Ireland. He started playing a cornet in a brass band when he was about 16 years old. And then he later immigrated first to Canada and then to the US, and he served in the militaries in both countries, both cases in military bands. And during the US Civil War, he was a member of the 24th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. And that's where he fell in love with these extravagant musical performances, when he was asked to give a spectacular performance during the occupation of New Orleans. After the war, he moved back to Boston. He began putting on the July 4th celebration every year on Boston Common. But he had dreams of something even grander. He'd say later that he was walking down the street one day in 1867 when he was struck with a vision, like a bolt from the blue. He was going to put on the largest musical festival in history, and he was going to do it in Boston. Unfortunately, sometimes vision alone is not enough. Gilmore couldn't get the permission he needed to build a giant Jubilee Hall on Boston Common. And he couldn't seem to raise enough capital to make his vision become a reality. But he got a big break when he convinced Jordan Marsh founder Eben D. Jordan, Sr., to join his organization as the treasurer. Marsh took a look at the Jubilee plan, and he realized that so many tourists coming to Boston would be very good for businesses like his, and he agreed to join the organization. He invested some of his money in the Jubilee, and he convinced his friends to invest likewise. And of course, his friends were the richest people in Boston, so that's helpful. After that, things got a lot easier, and it was simply a matter of moving the proposed Jubilee from the Common to the newly filled lands of the Back Bay. At that point, things really came together. The Jubilee was held, and it even made a slight profit. The businessmen who underwrote it, they got their initial investments back through ticket sales, and even just a smattering on top, along, of course, with the increased business they saw from the thousands of tourists who flocked to Boston for the event. Now, the Coliseum building itself was always intended as a temporary building. Again, this giant building, largest on the continent at the time, was scheduled to be torn down before the end of 1869. Before they even got that far, a great September gale that year caused extensive damage to the building. And then, of all things, an earthquake that October did a lot more damage. And even though by that time, a lot of the building had been demolished and sold as scrap, Gilmore decided in 1872 that he was going to revive the Coliseum because he had a new vision for a world peace jubilee. Now, if a grand national peace jubilee was big, a world peace jubilee had to be bigger. Everything had to be bigger. More singers, more instrumentalists, a bigger Coliseum, more of everything, that is, except for interest from the public. In 1872, ticket sales were lackluster at best, and Patrick Gilmore got out of the Jubilee business after that. So that's my very abbreviated overview of the history of the Grand Peace Jubilee. We have a more detailed version of this available as a podcast, which we recently re-released from about 2 years ago. You can find that at hubhistory.com/peacejubilee. And the thought I'll leave you with is that in 1889, to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Peace Jubilee, there was a performance at Mechanics Hall on Huntington Avenue, again, just steps from here. I think it was probably much like the one we were going to see tonight. It featured the pieces from the original Jubilee on a smaller scale. So in that spirit, I want to get our 150th anniversary performance started with the Anvil Chorus, which I'm very excited to introduce. It's going to be performed by the New England Conservatory Chamber Singers and Wind Ensemble, and it will feature members of the Greater Boston Firefighters Pipes and Drums.
Now, we can ask Jake to verify this, but it's my understanding that President Grant was so intrigued by the Anvil chorus that he required multiple encores through the Peace Jubilee. And I guess when we were beginning to put this program together, it was a secret wish of mine that we'd be able to replicate that. And I want to give a shout out to the Greater Boston Firefighters, pipes and drums. They learned a new instrument for this evening. I don't know how you did it. Well, I'm very pleased now to introduce our keynote speaker, Theodore Landsmark, who was an educator, attorney, architect, social activist, a distinguished professor and director of the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern University. He holds a PhD in American and New England Studies from Boston University and professional degrees in law, environmental design from Yale. So would you all join me in welcoming Dr. Landsmark? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Never in my life did I imagine that I would follow a group of firefighters playing anvils in a public library. And for that, I want to offer special thanks to the associates for putting together what I think is an extraordinarily creative event and concert this evening, the likes of which I am almost certain you will never experience again. Tonight we commemorate a jubilee that marked the end of a civil war that epitomized a divided nation, what was thought of as the restoration of peace that was celebrated in 1869, in 1872, and I should note there was a 20-year retrospective that took place in 1889. The Civil War killed or maimed 620,000 Americans over the course of 4 years. In the 1860s, that Civil War had affected essentially every single American family, and Patrick Gilmore and others here in Boston were ready at the end to make a great noise to celebrate its conclusion. The Jubilees brought together the largest choruses and multiple orchestras from here and abroad. In 1869, the military band and orchestra alone were composed of almost 1,100 musicians, 103 choral groups, and 10,000 singers. It was truly a joyous time here in New England. But not everyone in America felt the same sense of jubilation, particularly in the South. The devastation of being a loser in that great conflict prevailed for decades, and those decades became generations, leading to much unfinished business, the effects of which we still feel today. As a nation, and particularly here in the North, we were inclined in 1869 towards a sense of jubilation, but we also didn't entirely put together and in place and then sustain the mechanisms that could lead to reconciliation and healing. The lingering results of that lack of healing included a shortened Reconstruction, decades of violence and Jim Crow laws, and lingering patterns of segregation in the South and here in the North. A full century after that war, the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s became a key indicator of our nation's effort to address those lingering racial inequalities and injustice. I was personally able to participate in that movement as a college student who took part in the March on Selma, Alabama. These days, when I mention that to my students, they think I must have played some great heroic role, but the fact is my role was very small. I drove south with 2 divinity students, and when I got to Selma, I ended up making sandwiches for the marchers. I was a very small part of a large infrastructure that ultimately produced voting successes and a number of changes across the South. But even with that small role, I learned that very small acts of conscience can be transformative, both for myself and perhaps in some ways for others. There was a small Alabama town we drove into early in the morning where the 2 white divinity students and I went up to a breakfast counter and tried to offer some breakfast coffee. And after sitting for about a half an hour and being ignored, it became clear that the coffee was not going to be served. And this was before a few local fellows in a pickup truck escorted us out of town and made sure that we didn't come back. But what struck me was the waitress at that lunch counter who came up to us, the 3 of us, trembling, literally with tears in her eyes, and she said, "I'm sorry, boys. I'd really like to serve you, but I just can't. I can't. Because I have to live here, and you'll be gone." I've never forgotten the poignant look on that waitress's face and the courage that she showed even to come and talk to us. And then after one night of prayer meetings in Selma, I got lost on my way back to the home of the Black family that lived off on the outskirts of town on a dirt road. And I looked up and I saw that there were lights approaching, and we'd been told that we had to watch out at night because there were night riders out looking for Northerners like myself. And if they found us, they'd either beat us up or kill us. And I spent that night in the bushes, hiding, and thinking about how the Black families in Selma had to live in that kind of fear every day, deprived of good schools and good jobs and not being able to vote, and how we have to all think about our values when we say we're in a part of a shared community within a largely divided nation. Sometimes here in New England, we like to think of ourselves as being very progressive and ethical in comparison to folks elsewhere in the country. And when we do that, we sometimes forget to hold a mirror up to ourselves to see how others see us. National events over the last few years in Charleston and Pittsburgh, where I was this morning, and Charlottesville, and even in suburban Boston, remind us that we have lots of unfinished business to address when it comes to social inequality. We like to think of ourselves as national leaders here in New England, that we're open and ethical and progressive. Yet here in Boston, our corporations, our nonprofits, and our great universities employ and work with just as few people of color as was found in these institutions 30 years ago. Data shows that Boston is one of the most racially segregated cities in America when it comes to our housing patterns. Our schools still show major disparities in learning outcomes. And the average net worth of a white family in Greater Boston is $247,500 compared to an average net worth of the average Black family in our area of only $8. We look at these disparities and we have to think sometimes that the issues are just too big to overcome. And so we act as though someone else is going to have to fix them, the government maybe. But the disparities are not too big for us to address as private citizens. Small personal acts of courage can make a really big difference when we think about celebrating our victories, as we think about celebrating victories tonight. We can lead in our families and among our friends and in our language, in our workplaces, in our social settings, in our networks, and in our housing patterns. We can individually make a difference in addressing inequalities. We can speak up when we hear someone say something disparaging or offensive or demeaning about another person. We can break through our inertia and seek out people who may look and sound a bit different than we are, and we can offer them jobs and educational opportunities to those people who we might have once thought of as the other. We can mentor young people. I could not stand here before you tonight had it not been for the mentoring of a number of older white men who saw possibilities in my growth. We can express our values in our actions as we build our community. It's in this regard that a great library plays a major role. My first job as a teenager was shelving books at my local public library in East Harlem. My first job as a student at Yale was in the college library. I love libraries because I know how they can transform the life of a poor kid from a public housing project. This and other great libraries are the repositories and distributors of the very best of our culture. Our libraries are the healers and advocates for our mental health and our sense of community. Libraries are both archives and advocates for our shared values. And special collections are particularly valuable in shaping and sharing our values. When I first came to Boston, I almost lived in the art collection next door as I thought about my personal role in Boston's arts and cultural scene. Thanks to what I learned in the art section here, I ended up opening an art gallery and became a dean at Mass Art and a trustee at the MFA. And thanks in part to this specialized library, I expanded my knowledge and I continue to do so. And as an architecture school president, I constantly referred design and planning students to the Leventhal map collection here to learn about development patterns and sustainability and resilience. So in both physical and spiritual realms, this great library's special collections are the glue that holds together our cultural values and gives us the reasons to be in dialogue with one another. So here we are in 2019. Next year, in 2020, we'll all be passionately celebrating the arrival 400 years ago of the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock. But 1619 to 2019, this year, is also the 400th anniversary of the arrival in Virginia of the first enslaved Africans in the Americas. The paths of our two groups have diverged dramatically over the past 400 years, and we can now recognize and commemorate the contributions that both groups have made towards building this country. Sure, there's been a hierarchy and different economic outcomes, but we can celebrate the fact that we are today willing to make things better working together by reconciling inequalities. These coming years will be a time for us to engage in many small acts of courage to bring Americans back together. That is the work that will really make America great. When we think less of winners and losers, and then think more of our shared resources and values in a time of need that transcends racial and ethnic and gender and immigrant status difference, then in the act of healing, we will have much to celebrate. So let us be jubilant that we have the power to heal and reconcile among ourselves and with the rest of the world. In the spirit of this commemoration of the Jubilee of 1869, let us make the great noise that says first to ourselves and then to the rest of the world that our democracy is truly made up of, for, and by all of the people in this nation. Let us also prepare for Boston's 400th anniversary in 2030, just a decade from now. Let us prepare for this to be a city that encourages all of us to take major strides towards reducing the inequalities that still exist, just as Patrick Gilmore sought to celebrate Boston's contribution towards achieving social equality a century and a half ago. In the spirit of the first great National Peace Jubilee of 1869, let us shout that we stand together for a victory of conscience, a victory over fear and over inequality. Thank you. Let the music resume.
glorious. We all know Handel because of the Messiah and the Hallelujah Chorus, and we're going to hear the Hallelujah Chorus in a little while, but I think Handel is a little underappreciated these days. Beethoven, whose career overlapped with Mozart, knew Mozart's works and was impressed by them, of course, and Beethoven took lessons from Haydn and knew the works of Bach, but I've read that Handel was Beethoven's favorite composer, so we all need to watch out for performances of Handel. That was just beautiful. So as music moves us and touches our soul, so does poetry. And poetry was a big part of the Peace Jubilee in 1869. Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a beautiful new poem for the occasion called A Hymn of Peace, which celebrated the end of the Civil War and prayed that war would never return. And we thought we should include poetry in our program this evening, and we are thrilled and honored to have a very distinguished poet this evening. Her name is Porsha Olayiwola. She is Boston's Poet Laureate. And among other things, she's the artistic director at Mass Leap, which is a Massachusetts literary nonprofit that serves young artists. She co-founded the House Slam, and as you might expect, she's won all sorts of awards. And in 2014, she was the individual World Poetry Slam champion. And then in 2015, she was the National Poetry Slam champion. And the piece she's going to share with us this evening is called Unnamed. Please welcome Porsha.
Good evening, everybody. So good to see y'all's faces. So my name is Porsha Olayiwola, and I identify as half Nigerian and half Black Chicagoan, which is to say, I have the luxury of knowing the direct lineage of my name, Olayiwola. But as, a person who, got her degree in African American Studies, and also is just very much so a part of the Black diaspora, I often thought about the lineage of my mother's name, and recently started writing a book and took some time to kind of just do some research about the lineage of the name. And I wrote this poem that I'm going to share with you all. So I hope you all enjoy. After the Civil War, many recently freed slaves took a last name like Freedman or Freeman. Others took the last name of their slave masters. Some because they had to swiftly give a name to their newly acquired citizenship. Others with the hopes that they may be reunited with family who had been sold or separated during the institution of slavery. My mother's maiden name is Beatty, spelled B-A-T-T-I-E. Her family is from Mississippi. My grandmother's name is Bessie Beatty. Her mother, my great-grandmother, is named Elizabeth Beatty. In 1850, during a US Census, they do not list a person's property, just the names of slave owners in the count of the slaves in Mississippi. There was a woman by the name of Elizabeth Beatty who owned over 50 slaves. And I wonder if this is the cotton plantation my family roots grew from. I wonder if this is the name my ancestors placed aside their papers and fled the plantation with. Is there a magnolia tree down in Panola, Mississippi that has all of my family's blood? Williams is the most common last name for black folks. John Williams of the Louisiana plantation owned over 218 black people. After Williams, there's Johnson, then Smith, Jones, Jackson, Brown. Racial traumas and triggers are a formal greeting when we call our oppressor's name to introduce ourselves, when our names are a historical leash. Every time I meet a black person with the last name Beatty, I wonder if we are finally attending the family reunion. Every time I meet a white person with the last name Beatty, I wonder if they know what their family has done, what abuse has allowed them their breath. What a privilege to know which end of the whipping whip has your name on it, to know exactly what your name is attached to have a name embroidered on the bedroom door instead of the quarters. What a privilege. On the job application, at the bank, at the airport, in the emergency room, and people wonder about black names, why the names aren't shorter, why the runaway syllables aren't easier to catch, about why we name our children after birds, after cars, after movement, wonder why black names are always spelled with distinction, why black names always have a flair. It's because countries who declare independence get to name themselves, because the marginalized will always know reclamation. And when our names do not have your lineage, when our names are not what you expect, then what did you expect? For us to introduce ourselves, still running, for us to shake hands, still dripping the blood you drew. Thank you all so much.
I did not know words that would precede this, and I was sitting there so moved by them and wondered if it would seem incongruous for us to play what we were about to play, sing what we were about to sing. It occurs to me that there are words which transcend. It's provided freedom in many ways. I don't like these very much. I understand. There is music that transcends even the most righteous anger. And we hope that we're offering this to you in a spirit of reconciliation, as the Peace Jubilee offered for reconciliation. To love one another. Not to bury the past, but to accept it, but to move on. Alleluia. what an evening. This is the inaugural performance of what we call the Pierce Performance Series. It was designed to highlight the library's special collections. My goodness, we've highlighted a lot of things this evening, and I thank our speakers, and our musicians. I'm so moved and privileged to be part of this. And stay tuned for future performances of the Pierce Performance Series. So I want to say we would not be here without my good friend, Harry Pratt, who all right, Harry. Harry very, very generously facilitated a grant to the associates from the Harold Whitworth Pierce Charitable Trust. And he makes this evening possible. And I think it's fair to say that Harry's the first citizen of New England Conservatory, having been a lifelong supporter of that wonderful organization. And Harry received an honorary doctorate from New England Conservatory in 2017. And I think it's also fair to say that Harry, through his lifelong commitment to philanthropy, is one of the first citizens of Boston. So, Harry, will you stand up and take a bow? He's in the balcony. So thanks also to our talented musicians who performed for us this evening. And our conductors, Charles Peltz, Erica Washburn, it's brilliant. Our podcaster, Jake Sconyers. Our keynote, the brilliant Dr. Landsmark. Our brilliant poet, Porsha Olayiwola. A shout out to Anita Lincoln, who's on our board at the Associates and was the chairperson for this wonderful evening. And thanks to Anita, where are you? Anyhow, thanks to you and your vision of having the concert in this fabulous space and all the people who worked on this event. I want to give a shout out to Louisa Stevens, who's our executive director. And of course, President David Leonard here at the BPL and President Andrea Kalin of New England Conservatory. So happily, I am not the last word. We have some more music for you. Thanks everybody for coming this evening, and stay a little bit afterwards, have a glass of wine and enjoy yourselves. And thank you so much for coming. Good night.
In honor of President Grant and his numerous encores, you're going to get an encore. And then we'll play a march for you to go out with.